Hi and welcome back to Bike Speeds. This week we're going to service this Specialized Allez. There was a lot wrong with this bike. The front brake was dangerous, the rear derailleur was dangerous, it needed a new rear derailleur cable, it needed some work on the headset bearing. We've also salvaged the rider's next ride by preventing a puncture, and we'll show you that as the video goes on. But this bike definitely needed this service. Quite an unusual bike. It's a 3x8. You can see here the chain isn't too badly worn. This was a tale of the whole bike. Actually, it hadn't got a lot of wear in it, but there was a lot wrong. Also, the front chain rings weren't changing gear at all, and we addressed that issue. So with any service, I weigh up a bike as I strip it down, begin to weigh up what needs doing, what's wrong with the bike. I'll be feeling things like wheel bearings, bottom bracket bearings. But the first things off of this one were the chain and wheels. And then I'm taking off the cassette and spoke protector off the rear wheel. In the case of this bike, I could quickly tell it was very low mileage, but as you can see here, the grime had built up on it. It had been well oiled, which isn't a bad thing always because it will keep the components nicely lubricated. But look at this. This rear derailleur was very close to failing. The hanger itself was very loose, as was the mount on the derailleur itself to that hanger. So everything was loosening up here. We had this frayed cable. It was all beginning to go wrong. It was only a matter of time before all of this would have become an issue and a problem on the bike. So the first thing I need to do is get this derailleur off, get it cleaned up, sort out that derailleur hanger and the cable to make sure that we've got nicely shifting gears and that we're not going to have an issue with the wheel coming out of this holder and causing a catastrophic failure. This bike had been on a turbo trainer, so that's the kind of thing that can cause a bike to come loose in the trainer, and you can end up with an indoor accident simply because all that was coming loose and was about to fall off. Now, we also took off the front derailleur. This one you can see very little wear in it, but it has got that nice layer of grease and oils on there, which we will clean off and re-lubricate and make that nice. And also it wasn't changing gears, so we'll need to address that once we've cleaned it up. We're going to take the pedals off and the chain rings and the chain set right off the bike. Again, it got that oil residue build up, so we wanted to really deeply clean this just to make sure it was nice. There's also a lot of dust you can see around that bottom bracket area. Again, where it had been indoors, it accumulated a little bit of dust on there, so we need to clean that off as well and make the bike nice and presentable. So off comes the chain set. Undo that center bolt first. That's always a 14mm, so that comes off. Then we use our extractor tool to remove that chain set off of the bottom bracket, and you can see here it's just grimy. It's not badly worn, it's just oiled and impregnated, so we're going to strip these rings off of that and really clean that up. We're also going to remove the brakes, front and rear. Again, it does no harm to get these through the ultrasonic cleaner, and again they were quite dusty. They had this sort of fluffy dust on them where it had been indoors, and this front brake was completely loose on this brake pad. Again, you wouldn't notice that on your turbo trainer. A lot of vibration through the bike probably has caused that to come loose. The issue there would be you go out on the road and you may not realize that that's loose, and that's an accident the second you pull the brake. So we're going to address that as well. The customer was actually aware of that, but it'd be very easy not to actually realize that that was loose and start riding a bike. So a service like this is very important, even for your turbo trainer bike. You can see there a lot of grime under the brake, and we also removed this derailleur cable. We noticed it was frayed at the other end, but look at this, it had already lost its first strand in the shifter. That's actually quite common on this generation of shifter, for them to fray out inside the shifter. That was the very early sign. That will initially start giving you poor shifting and eventually break or fray and clog up inside the shifter and cause all manner of problems. So this service was absolutely perfectly timed to make sure that the bike is running smoothly moving forwards. Next up, I'm going to strip down this chain rings off of this chain set to clean those up, deep clean those in the ultrasonic cleaner, and I shall also remove the jockey wheels from the rear derailleur so that I can really do a nice deep clean on this component and re-lubricate it and get it absolutely perfect to go back on the bike. So you can see here we've got an ultrasonic cleaner. We use a 6 litre ultrasonic cleaner We never ever use heat on any of the parts on the bike. It's very, very important not to use heat. You can damage anodizing and things if you use a bit of heat in these. You can see the dirt and grime lifting out of that component. You can see that was fresh solution in there, and now it's already lifted the greases out of these components. So once they've been through the ultrasonic cleaner, I wash them down in warm soapy water, then I dry them out. Sometimes I use an airline, most of the time I use microfiber towels. We don't always show that on camera because it's not that interesting, but we do dry these components out after they've been washed down like this. But you can already see how those parts are really cleaned up. Such an in-depth way of cleaning a component. You can really get in the areas that you cannot get in just by brushes and your hands alone. Also clean up the spoke protector. It's not our job to take that off, so we'll make sure that goes back on the bike. Clean out the chain. Again, that ultrasonic cleaner will get right in the rollers so that we can re-lubricate that, and it'll be fresh as a daisy when it goes back on the bike. Next up, I'm going to rebuild the chain set. So I use a little bit of our copper grease on the threads of the bolts, and I use our general purpose grease just where the spiders meet the chain rings themselves so that they don't bond and stick. It just makes them a little bit easier to get them apart on the next service from my point of view as the mechanic doing the work. So that's something the customer will never notice, but it would stop those components bonding together and everything will come apart next time. So in goes those bolts. So we initially get this loosely together, and once I've got that together, I'll then get out my torque wrench and I'll torque these down. Anything with the bottom bracket area, chain set area, I always torque those up as I rebuild them so as it pulls everything together, because obviously it's a left-right motion of the front derailleur, so I need everything to be in its final position. So that's what I was just doing there. I'm going to rebuild the jockey wheels. So we've greased those with our premium grease straight out of one of our syringes. We do these syringes on our website in a pack of 5 and individually as refills, or if there's just one that you need. So do check out our website for those. And then I'm just going to pop this derailleur back together. So you saw there I put a little bit of Loctite to stop these axles from coming loose inside those jockey wheels there. Again, we do Loctite on our website as well. Often the missing element of any service is not to lubricate thumb adjusters. They're very prone to corroding into components, be that on a frame adjuster or a derailleur adjuster like this. You always want to make sure that you lubricate your thumb adjusters, and I do that with all the thumb adjusters to make sure that they're not going to bond and stick, and that they will work when you actually need to make your adjustments out on the road, that they're nicely smooth and actuate as they should. Using our general purpose grease there on the pivot points, same on this front derailleur, a little bit of our premium grease on the spring to stop that corroding, and then our general purpose oil with our lovely little applicator needle to make sure that we have everything there moving smoothly as it needs to. And I'm just going to tighten up this front brake pad before we start putting the bike back together. Now this bike actually had here packaging from factory new. This should be removed by the shop before the bike's sold. It's just to stop that component getting damaged when it's in the box loose at this point. So we removed that packaging and cleaned up that arm, and I'm also using a little bit of silicone grease there on the slider of the brake so that it actuates and is nice and smooth, and lubricate the pivot points again on the brake itself. And as I mentioned before, that thumb adjuster, a little bit of our copper grease on the threads, and then I'm also going to pop in a little bit of general purpose grease just inside there, because the outers of the brake cables actually fit that tightly on these particular ones, so I make sure that I've lubricated that so as the cable will actually move when you use that thumb adjuster. Again, with the skewers, I lubricate those. It's very common to have corrosion inside the wheel hub itself. We don't want that bonding where we can't even get the wheel off. And now the next issue I had to address, and this one was quite surprising, the headset bearings on this were very, very tight. I quoted the customer for new headset bearings once I realised this, but actually we didn't need to replace them, and I'll show you why and the issues that we have with that as we take this apart. So initially I'm taking it apart, assuming at this stage I'm going to be doing the bearings, but when I did get them apart, the bearings weren't that worn. In fact, they were pretty good. So you can see here, this is bearings in their own race. Took those out, and as you can see here, very little wear. There's still some grease on them. They were obviously over tensioned. The preload on them was a little bit too tight, but there was also another reason why this headset wasn't flowing nicely, and it's right here. We had 2 crowns on the forks. So there should only ever be one. You can see that I'm pointing to the lower one there that is actually pressed onto the forks, and this one was dropped over the top and was just sitting on the original crown race. Very, very odd. I've never seen that before. There should never be two. So we're going to clean up the original one, which actually had no markings on it. It was absolutely perfect. I'd imagine it's never run a bearing around it. You can see there how shiny that is. So that's absolutely fine. So we're going to get that back together with just one crown race on there. Now I'm happy. I'm just going to grease everything up. So we'll grease the bottom one first, drop the bearing on. So that bearing now sits on there nicely, and then I'll just pop a little bit of extra grease around the top of that to make sure it's nicely lubricated. And then I'll do the same with the top. So we're using our premium grease here. Bearings felt totally fine in the grease, so I have no worries about reusing them. All of the problems with that headset came from the crown and over tightening alone. And then we can get the forks back in. And once I did this, these were like different steering forks. It was amazing, really. But obviously we had a little bit too much gap here in the top. The bolt on the stem would have been pulling right on its top limit. You can actually fracture the stem if it's too high and that bolt is pulled too close together. So we just altered those spacings slightly on that one so that it sat a little bit neater. You can see there a little bit lower on the stem. The customer won't notice that, but it will be mechanically more sound for when we put the cap on and when we tighten everything up. So once we get this back together, I did a little test run on the handlebars. They felt completely different to the way the bike came in. You can see how smooth they are. The time you'll notice this is if ever you take your hands off of the handlebars. Bike with tight steering will tram line down the road. You won't be able to let go without having to catch the handlebars. When they're smooth and loose like that, the bike will ride much, much smoother. It will be less fatiguing to ride and safer to ride as well. So next up, I'm going to wash the bike down. So we're using a warm soapy water substance there, and we're going to wash that down with our big softy brush. Again, these are available on our website. A lot of what we use on these videos is available on our website. We're actually increasing our ranges all the time to allow for things that we are using and getting those so that you can buy those as well. So do please check out our website. The link is always in the description of all the videos, and it's a way for us to finance the YouTube journey. So you're kind of helping us out as well. When you do buy something from us, it's always very much appreciated. So once I've done the frame, I'm also going to wash down the wheels. It's a nice way for me to check the wheels. I check the spokes, I feel the tensions of them. These wheels were pretty greasy, and being rim braked, it's very important to remove that grease. That's where the microfiber towels are great for leaving no residue at all behind. Next up, I've put a little bit of our general purpose grease on that hub so as the cassette again will come on and off for future servicing. Both the cassette and spoke protector cleaned up incredibly. They both look like new. Torque that up, and then I'm also going to rotate this tyre. You can see here the manufacturer's logo and the valve are not in line. I like to always line those up. You've seen that on many of our other videos. It's a good way for you when you get a puncture to be able to check to see where in the tyre that puncture is and locate it easier, and also it's just aesthetically much more pleasing to have everything lining up. So logos and valve all lining up. Check the rotation of your tyres as well. Most tyres are rotational. A lot I see rotating in the wrong direction, so make sure that you rotate them correctly so that they clear water away from the edges of the tyre. And then I'm going to inflate that tyre up. I do that also with the front tyre, and now I can begin to put the bike back together. The first thing that's going back on is the chain set. I'm really happy with how that came up. Silver components always clean up incredibly well on a bike. Again, as I mentioned, I torque everything up in the bottom bracket area so that everything is aligned correctly for the front derailleur. Everything's tight and as it should be. Just using a little bit of general purpose grease on the splines of the bottom bracket there. Press everything back in, torque everything up. Quite happy with the way that's going. You can see there the bearing in this one was actually very good. All the bearings on this bike were good, which again suggests to me that this is a very low mileage bike. And although it's an older generation, these are cracking bikes for turbo bikes and winter bikes, and even if you're just getting into the hobby of cycling, a bike like this is brilliant really when you can find one in this condition. So on goes the front derailleur. Now you can see here that there's something wrong with the way these screws are adjusted. So I'm going to need to adjust this. Actually, this bike when it came in had no usable gears on the front. It was held on one ring, but we're going to make sure that it runs over all three of the rings that we've got. So we'll reattach the cable, adjust those screws, torque everything up, and then once the chain's on, I can do my final adjustments there. Just going to put a little bit of general purpose grease between the frame and the dropout here to make sure that we get no dissimilar metals bonding or any problems there. Torque that up, put the rear derailleur on. On goes a new cable. I'm actually using our super slick cables here, again available on our website. These are a lovely tightly wound stainless steel cable, very smooth through your fingers, far smoother than most manufacturer type cables. They're very tightly wound and they are a lovely cable, these super slick cables. We use these on everything. They're all that I keep in stock. We'll use these on all genres of bikes and they are great cables. Now the brakes are going back on. Neither the front or rear needed a new cable. They both actuated smoothly and had enough of a tail on the cable that we could reuse them. New cable ends on there. You saw I cut those off so that I could get them out of the thumb adjusters. Same with the front. A little bit of copper grease on this one. These are very prone to getting corrosion through the forks there. You get a lot of debris in there and it's very common for those to go rusty, so we resolved that with a little bit of copper grease to make sure that we can take that off in the future. You can see there I've roughly got the front brake pad in the correct position so that that's now tight, the one that was loose. On go the wheels. You can see what huge difference we're beginning to make to this bike. On goes that chain. No need to replace that. That had very little wear in it as well, so we'll just get the quick link together. That chain is now on, so I can now do my adjustments on the gears. So there was just a little bit of adjustment needed. It wasn't quite dropping, it was hanging a little bit, so a little bit of a thumb adjuster there. The front, actually I got that absolutely perfect by eye with adjusting those screws, so that was going up and down. And now check my brakes. So the rear one is working perfectly. The front one now has that safe brake pad and is working perfectly. And this is the customer's next puncture that we're going to stop. So I go around the tyres on all servicing that I do, and I noticed here we had a little nick in the tyre and I could see something glistening in there. So I'm just going to work my screwdriver in there and look at that. That there is a piece of glass, and that would have worked through every time the tyre's going round, your weight's going onto that tyre. That would have carried on pushing its way through the tyre and would have caused a puncture. We actually found 3 or 4 bits of debris like that in the tyres of this bike, so he may have took this off the turbo trainer, took it out for a ride, guaranteed puncture. And in fact, I've often heard of people who've had punctures on a turbo trainer and they're baffled by it, but that's actually the reason why: debris in the tyre working its way through. So this service was quite timely in timing, in that we sorted out the front brake, sorted out that future puncture, sorted out the rear derailleur where that was very close to failure. So this bike was on the limits without the rider even realising it. But we've sorted this bike out. So all that's left for us to do is to go through the bike with a torque wrench. The headstock was totally loose on this bike. That could also have been an accident waiting to happen, with the bars or shifters dropping down and causing a crash. You can see here that the saddle and the saddle clamp were loose, especially the saddle. So again, riding over a few hours, that would have carried on loosening up and eventually the saddle would have come loose. So again, very timely to get this bike serviced. I'm running through the brakes and the rear derailleur, making sure they're on tight enough. I've obviously had these off, but I still make sure they're correctly torqued. The bottle cage bolts were completely loose, so they were a small detail that I tidied up. And then the final thing to do on this bike is to oil the chain. I'm using a nice thin oil on the rollers of the chain to make sure it runs as smooth as possible. The whole drivetrain came up incredibly well without replacing a single component, and it looks mirror finished now. And as you can see from these before and after shots, what a monumental difference we've made to this bike. Quite unbelievable really. The little problems we find along the way is typical of any bike that we service. If you're new to the channel, please do subscribe. Do like the video, it helps with the algorithms and to get the video shared. And please do drop a comment. Maybe you've got an older bike, older generation bike like this that you absolutely swear by or use on your turbo trainer. tell us your stories with maintenance on those bikes. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you again very, very soon. Bye for now.